European Enlightenment can be crudely summarized as giving rise to a fusion between the antithetical ideas of individual freedom and dominion. Individual freedom coming from encountering people in the pre-colonial Americas practicing ideas of free will, rational dialogue, and the shocking realization by European colonizers visiting them that maybe people back in Europe could be free thinking too. The other idea is dominion. This comes from the practice of slavery as encoded by the Roman Empire as the legal ownership of your own or another person's body. This fusion between individual freedom and dominion goes to the very core of how science emerged post-Enlightenment, as a juxtaposition between reason and nature, subject and object, or mind and body, where the free-thinking, rational, reasoning mind controls its body, other bodies it owns, and other parts of nature as slaves, as property, as dominion. As a child of the Enlightenment, neoclassical economics developed as the science of decision-making and its aggregate consequences. It was based on the premise that every individual acts in the pursuit of rational and enlightened self-interest, and that the aggregate of these choices is what guides humanity's progress and civilization. Hence, if you're an animal, a child, a primitive hunter-gatherer, you aren't part of reason, you're part of nature. You're not civilized. So you need civilizing through colonialism, schooling, or the policing of nature. In the wake of this situation, the colonialism, schooling and so forth, debates and struggles ensued, leading to the post-colonial proposal that maybe, indeed, primitive people or hunter-gatherers could be acknowledged as human, as reasonable. In light of this, neoclassical economists, microeconomists, economic formalists, whatever variation you want to call them, contended, okay, if primitive hunter-gatherers do possess reason, we can explain it by attaching, let's say, a utility value to each unit of resource they hunt and gather, and measure it in terms of the satisfaction it yields. You can calculate an optimal strategy of resource procurement that would yield the highest overall utility relative to time and energy expended. By this rationale, we can call them reasonable. But what about non-human animals? Don't they also seem to be able to be conformed to such a rationale and a model? Strategies of resource procurement? Oh, don't worry, there's a chap called Darwin. According to Darwin, animals do, but they do this because of the evolutionary force of natural selection rather than reason. In natural selection, individuals with more efficient resource procurement or foraging strategies will have a reproductive advantage over individuals with less efficient strategies. And since these strategies, or more precisely formulas or programs for generating them, are encoded in the materials of heredity, the more efficient strategies will automatically tend to become more firmly established in each generation as their carriers bear proportionally more offspring. Oh, but can't we now just apply that back to humans? Yes, shout some Darwinists. We can help you out. We agree that humans are also subject to the law and order of natural selection. In step the evolutionary ecologists. They contend that the foraging behaviour of human hunter-gatherers, just like that of non-human animals, can be understood as an application of formulas or cognitive algorithms that have been shaped up through a Darwinian process of variation under natural selection, both humans and non-human animals. This process entails the idea that decision-making patterns, or patterns of making optimal decisions assumed to be self-interested, have evolved by natural selection as formulas. However, these formulas are not seen as genetically encoded in humans by evolutionary ecologists. Rather, the suggestion is that these formulas are contained within bodies of cultural information that are passed on in a manner analogous to genetic transmission. This cultural transmission, following the idea of genetic transmission, is viewed as a simple process of copying, in which a whole inventory of formulas are downloaded into the empty mind of the novice, who then expresses them like a gene expresses a phenotype. Okay, it's a bit weird. That's eminently not how learning works. But wait, we have another set of Darwinists who have something to say about this. In step, the evolutionary psychologists. They point out that there are differences in natural selection, but it must be acting on something else. They propose that there must be a mechanism for downloading this cultural transmission, analogous to the biological mechanism of inheritance. The evolutionary psychologist contends that the mechanism for downloading this transmission and processing it is the true thing that natural selection acts on. They note that nothing can be acquired or learned unless there is some kind of innate processing mechanism already in place to decode the cultural transmission, receiving and extracting information therein. You need a computer in order to read the internet. What's more, these innate information processing mechanisms don't only make transmission of culture possible, they also impose their structure on what can be learned and how. For evolutionary psychologists, it's the study of these mechanisms under natural selection that is the important thing to study. Of course, this means men are better at some things like hunting, and women are better at some things like gathering. Humans are better at animals at some things. Some humans are innately better than others. So you see, the stages of higher order and lower order life become intact, and we can maintain natural selection as explaining humans and non-humans, supposedly. This is where anthropologist Tim Ingold takes issue. He points out that at the very least, humans are not born with ready-made information processing mechanisms. They have to go through ontogenesis. They have to go through being in the womb, through growing from a child into an adult. So at best, one can say that if such a mechanism existed, it still could only emerge as part of the development of a human in a social context. So it's not possible to distinguish these mechanisms or their emergence from the multi-species ecology they develop in. But really, there simply is literally zero evidence for such mechanisms in the first place. In sum, evolutionary psychologists try to create a coherent account of human nature, but are blind to the development of human behaviour within the social and environmental conditions they grow in. And when it comes to evolutionary ecologists, they seek to show human behaviour responding to variations in the environment through ideas of cultural transmission, but lack a coherent account of actual human nature. I just want to extend these thoughts a little bit. Like many neuroscientists, evolutionary psychologists are doing a standard manoeuvre here. When something seems unexplained, they continually outsource decision-making and free will to yet another so-called higher component of the body. For some it's the nervous system, for others it's the human brain, for others it's some specific part of the human brain, for others it's some bunch of neurons within that part of some specific part of the brain, never ending. They admit they can never really explain, but still expect us to accept them, having simply reduced everything else to some kind of mindless conduit, information processing bunch of nodes. But we still have to believe that these are under the domain of some higher function, which they can never explain. One could argue that this endless outsourcing to an invisible higher order, dare I say invisible hand, reacts reflects an ideology that is so deeply hierarchical and biblical that it can only see in fixed hierarchies of coercive domination. And when it comes to the evolutionary ecologists, they're dependent on this idea of life as nodes transmitting information, emerging out of a transactional logic, basically capitalism, and they utterly fail to appreciate the relationality of life, but instead maintain an object-orientated philosophy grounded in the history of private property ideals, manifest in property deeds and blueprints inherited or sold over generations, that pretend, for example, that a farm can be represented by a property deed, like a human can be represented by a genetic code. Any meaningful farmer, so I'm not talking about property owner who exploits migrant labour, will tell you that the reality of a farm is the amazing amount of love and care and relations that one has with the soil, animals and other people you work with, and that these aren't captured within the deeds and hence get lost in big land transactions. But the big landowner or the industrial soil miner does not see this and instead imports more inputs, more transmissions of fertilizer to overcome having to acknowledge this fact. In a recent piece of work by Ingold, he demonstrates how the logic of inheritance used by Darwinists in many senses was directly copied from property deed inheritance practices. In other words, as I've joked elsewhere in a drag show that I do, Charles Darwin essentially borrows the idea of a tree of life from the British royal family's pedigree tree, which itself is historically entangled with the royal oak tree as depicted on the ruling party of the UK government. A specific oak tree that dates back many generations to the origin of the Tory party, in a ritual homage and worship of a tree that saved the last King Charles that sat on the throne. But I diverge. Let's get back to Ingold. What has he got to say? Ingold contends that learning depends on relationships between more or less experienced people in situ, in hands-on contexts, in practice. It is the reproduction of these relationships, not genetic replication or cultural transmission of some formula of cultural instructions, that the continuity of a practice learnt depends, and the ability to make decisions about how you go about that practice. Hence, it makes no sense to speak of culture as an independent body of context-free knowledge that is available for transmission prior to the situation of its application. The additional implication here is that we did not evolve as competitive actors within a world, but that we have intergenerationally and socially learnt with the world to make decisions about our practices. What will you decide to do as part of our world? How will you play and self-organise and see what we can create? Or will you try to force your goals on everyone else and justify this through an invisible higher order that makes decisions in your brain or is inherited from some crusty old pedigree tree that ought to be dead by now?